Hello everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Marcel Binz, who's currently at the Institute for Human-Centered AI at Helmholtz München. After a career that started with an undergraduate in cognitive science in Tübingen, followed by an MSc in machine learning in Stockholm, and then a PhD in psychology at the University of Marburg. And then he went back to Tübingen as a postdoc, now in Munich. He'll speak today about foundation models of human cognition, and I'm very much looking forward to this because Marcel has very much been at the forefront of attempts to use foundation models or evaluate foundation models in quite a literal way as models of cognition. So over to you, Marcel, and thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the nice introduction. I will talk about foundation models of human cognition today. I should say, if you have any questions in between, just feel free to interrupt me. I think we should have more than enough time for questions. I'm not monitoring the chat, so if there are questions in the chat, maybe someone can make me aware of that also. So foundation models of human cognition. I'm really fascinated by the human mind. And I think what is really the most fascinating thing about people is that we are really these amazing generalists. We can accomplish so many different things, right? We make scientific discoveries, we create inspiring art, we go out and explore nature, or we just have fun playing with our friends. It really seems like you can pretty much throw any problem at people and you will get some interesting behavior back. So how is that possible? Where do these broad cognitive abilities come from, and how do they fit into just one human mind? And these are really the kind of questions that keep me up at night, and also the questions that drive a lot of my research. And in order to try to solve these questions, I use tools from modern AI and machine learning to kind of poke at the internal mechanisms of human cognition. So before I can start talking a bit more about that, let me briefly summarize and illustrate how we typically do research in computational cognitive science. More often than not, you're interested in one particular domain or one particular aspect of human cognition. So say, for example, you're interested in decision making. Then you design a behavioral experiment, try to measure some human behavior in this particular domain that you're interested in. And finally, after you have collected this data, you try to explain it in some way, for example, using computational models or other kind of theories. And each individual study typically just looks at one singular domain, but across the field, this happens in many different areas of human cognition. So the kind of knowledge that I think we acquire in such a research paradigm is that we understand quite well how human cognition works on this middle layer here, on the level of the individual experiments that we are conducting. But what we don't really understand well is how this actually generalizes to the broader domains that we are in the end interested in, right? We're interested in how humans make decisions, and often not how humans make decisions in this particular experiment that we're running. And furthermore, we pretty much have no idea of how our knowledge that we accumulate in such a research setting translates between all of these domains. So I think a situation that we would much rather be in looks something like this, where we have a unified computational model that tries to capture and explain all of human cognition jointly. So I call these foundation models of human cognition in analogy to the foundation models that have become popular in the machine learning community in the recent years. And I think if we would have access to such a model, that would allow us to make much more robust and much more generalizable claims about the human mind. So now this idea of having a unified theory of human cognition is not a new one to psychology. Already, for example, Alan Newell in 1990 has said that we really need these unified models or unified theories of cognition because they are really the only way of how we can bring this wonderful and increasing fund of knowledge that we have under intellectual control. Now, this statement seems like it was made an eternity ago, But we as a field have further increased our wonderful fund of knowledge, but we still seem as far away as ever from having one of these unified theories of human cognition that Newell is talking about here. So really raising the question of how we can make any meaningful progress towards them. So it turns out we have recently seen the emergence of a class of computational systems that, at least to some extent, could be considered generalist agents. Of course, I'm talking about large language models, or LLMs here. These are huge neural networks trained on vast amount of data taken from the internet simply to predict the next word in a given text sequence. But as we scaled up these models in the recent years, we found that they have many emergent abilities that go far beyond mere text generation. And modern language models can, amongst other things, translate between languages, they can write computer code for you, or they can solve challenging reasoning problems. So I think really these are the first kind of computational systems that have this very human-like characteristic that you can just pretty much throw any problem at them and you will get some interesting behavior back. And that obviously caught my interest. And I guess about 3 years ago, I started to wonder whether it's possible to take some of these models and place them in a psychology lab, run psychological experiments on them. If that would be possible, that would be quite a powerful approach to understand how these black box machines reason, how they think, how they make decisions, and so on. And who knows, maybe by studying these models from a psychological perspective, we would find out that we have already our hand at one of these foundation models of human cognition that I was talking about earlier. So we summarized our results in a paper called Using Cognitive Psychology to Understand GPT-3, in which we took the best language model out there back then, which was GPT-3, and subjected it to a battery of canonical experiments that are coming from the cognitive psychology literature. So these covered domains like decision-making, deliberation, exploration, causal reasoning, and so on. I'll not have time to go over all of the details of our results and analysis today, but I want to present one example that kind of illustrates of how the analysis that we did looked like, because that will set the stage nicely for the main part of the talk. So one of the first experiments actually that we looked at was the well-known two-step task. It's a simple reinforcement learning paradigm designed to detect whether people engage in model-based or model-free reinforcement learning. It's probably one of the most widely studied paradigms in all of psychology and cognitive neuroscience. So in this task, people start in an initial state up here. They have the choice between two actions, in this case, the red action and the green action, that probabilistically lead to one of two states. Once you arrive at these states, you have the choice between two actions again, and you get varying amount of reward depending what action you pick. And then the whole process repeats again. You select between the red and the green action again, and so on. So in order to test a language model like GPT-3 on these kind of problems, we designed a text-based version of this task. So the prompts that we used for this were essentially created in a way that they contain all the information that human participants get as well when they come into the lab and do the studies. So it starts with a brief description of the task that has to be solved. In this case, it says that you will travel to foreign planets and search for treasures. And when you visit a planet, you can choose an alien to trade with. The chances of getting treasures from these aliens changes slowly over time. And your goal is to maximize the number of treasures that you collect. Then we also provide the model with a summary of all previous interactions it had with this problem. So in this case, essentially, it boils down to a list of previous transitions where each item contains information about where have you been, what did you do, where did you end up, and how much reward did you get. And finally, we asked the model, given that you're in the current state, so in this case that you are on one of these two planets, what do you want to do next? And a language model would solve these kind of problems simply by completing the prompt that is shown here. In this case, either responding trading with alien D or trading with alien F. So we just tested GPT-3 on the 4 domains or experiments from the 4 domains that I outlined earlier. And really to our surprise back then, we found that the model performed quite well, even outperforming human subjects in some of these areas. Now, results like this are a bit more expected nowadays, but back then that was really almost mind-blowing for us to see that you could just take about any experiment from the literature, translate into text, give it to a computational system, and the system would actually do something meaningful. That GPT-3 was really the first kind of computational model that had this kind of ability, and I think that was really revolutionary. One notable exception was the causal reasoning paradigm that we looked at, and I come back to that in a second. But then when we investigated more closely how the model actually solved these kind of problems, we found that its behavior quite strikingly diverged from human behavior. And in particular, we found the biggest differences in the domains of exploration and causal reasoning. And I think that makes sense if we just briefly remind ourselves of how these models are trained, right? They're simply trained to passively predict the next word in a given text sequence. But exploration and causal reasoning are two domains that place a very strong emphasis on active interactions with your environment. And I think this mismatch that we are seeing here between the training objective of these models and what is required by the task at hand also explains why we see the biggest divergences in these two domains. So we did a lot of follow-up works on this paper that in the interest of time, I don't talk so much about, but I want to briefly highlight some of these works. So we wrote a tutorial paper on how to use open source large language models specifically in the context of behavioral sciences. Together with my colleagues at Google DeepMind, we have recently written a conceptual paper where we lay the foundation for this new and emerging field that we coin machine psychology, which uses tools from psychology to understand the behavior of large-scale systems, such as large language models. We have also created a benchmark that allows us to measure cognitive abilities of language models across a wide spectrum of metrics and across a large set of behavioral experiments. We looked at what happens when you condition these models on anxiety-inducing text. And we found that this actually makes these models much more racist, much more ageist, much more sexist, and so on. And finally, we observed that large language models have a very strong optimism bias, meaning that they learn much more from positives than from negative prediction errors. In fact, they don't learn much from negative prediction errors at all. And all of these findings, I think, are important to contextualize and understand what the current iteration of models can do and where the current failure modes are. So where does all of this leave us now? I think language models are certainly impressive in many ways, right? They're really the first kind of computational systems that bring us just a tiny step closer towards the generality of human cognition. And they really invite us to rethink many of our theories that we have about the human mind. But at the same time, as we have seen, these models are also a lot unlike human cognition in many ways. And that essentially leads me to the question that is currently driving a lot of my research, which is now, how can we now use these models and use them to improve our understanding of human cognition? Or in other words, how can we turn them into cognitive models? So you might stop me here and say, well, working towards a foundation model of human cognition, like the ones that I've pitched in the beginning, all that we have to do for that is we have to wait. We have to scale up these models, make them bigger, train them on more data, and eventually we get at a model that one of these foundation models of human cognition. I think that is unlikely to be the case, especially if you look at some of the recent work. So here's, for example, one paper showing that human-like intuitive behavior and reasoning biases have emerged in large language models, but then they disappeared again in newer models such as ChatGPT. Another paper with a similar storyline. Here the authors argue for the emergence of economic rationality of GPT. And in particular, they show that the newer models, such as GPT-4, are much more rational. They lose a lot of the cognitive biases that we know are present to be in people. And these are just two examples. There are many more that go in a similar direction that really indicate that just scaling up these models won't lead to one of these foundation models of human cognition. Instead, I think what is key is having access to the right kind of data. Data is really the fuel that drives these large-scale models. And that is why I've recently assembled a large-scale international collaboration of over 40 researchers from across the globe. And together we have created the largest cross-domain data set of human behavior in existence that we call Psych 101. So Psych 101 really reaches an unprecedented scale. It contains human records from over 160 psychological experiments, all translated into a natural language format that can be readily processed by large language models. It contains records from over 60,000 individual participants, and these participants make over 10 million human choices. And you really find all of the classics of cognitive psychology in it. So risky choice experiments, similarity judgment tasks, working memory problems, and so on. You pretty much name it. Here's kind of one example of how the individual data points in our data set look like. Here's kind of each data point should represent an entire session done by human participants coming into the lab and doing the study, containing all the information of the instruction that a participant has gotten, the stimuli that a participant has seen, and the responses that they made. So here, in this case, this is a similarity judgment task that says that you will be presented with triplets of objects that are assigned to different keys. And then in each trial, you have to indicate which object you think is the odd one out by pressing the corresponding key. And then the actual experiment starts. In the first trial, the participant sees 3 objects, a prune, nail polish, and a diskette. And in this case, that particular participant decided that the diskette is the odd one out of these objects. And then the prompt contains all of the following choices that that participant has made in this particular session. You also see these specific characters highlighted in purple here and marked in these specific tokens. And these correspond to the choices by human participants. And we marked them specifically because that makes it easier for follow-up pipelines to process these human choices if you want to analyze them in some way or the other. So we then took this large data set, Psych 101, and fine-tuned a language model on it in order to align that model with human behavior. More specifically, we started with the large 70 billion parameter version of the open source model Llama 3.1. We applied a fine-tuning technique known as quantized low-rank adaptation, and that led to the first foundation model of human cognition that we call Centaur. So we're really looking for a long time for a mythical creature that is half llama and half human, because apparently you're supposed to name these models like that. Couldn't find anything, so eventually we had to settle on some kind of nearest neighbor, and Centaur was the creature that was closest to what we actually wanted to get. I won't talk so much about the fine-tuning details, but I want to give maybe a high-level overview of how this technique, the quantized low-rank adaptation or QLoRa that we used, works. It basically takes a pre-trained large language model as a base model. It quantizes the parameters of this model to 4-bit precision and freezes these parameters. So the base parameters of this base model, in this case, in our case, the Llama 3.170 billion model, are not adjusted during fine-tuning on human behavior. Instead, what QLoRa does, it adds these so-called low-rank adapters to each layer of the base model. And these low-rank adapters contain only a few trainable parameters that are adjusted to human choices during this process of fine-tuning. So in our case, the number of parameters that are in these low-rank adapters are around 0.1% of the total parameters of the model. So just a tiny bit. And we have chosen this approach for kind of 2 reasons. First of all, it's very useful in this case to preserve all the background knowledge that is present in these language models. And we want to keep that knowledge. We don't want to override it through this process of fine-tuning, because all of this background knowledge might be useful for generalization to out-of-distribution experiments that you have not seen during training. So that's one reason. And the other reason is maybe a bit more practical. This is a technique that you can actually do with computational resources of, let's say, a well-equipped academic lab. All of this can be actually conducted on just a single large 80 gigabyte GPU, which makes it quite appealing for research labs to rely on a strategy like this. So, and then we wanted to see how well can Centaur, the model that we obtained from this fine-tuning process, how well can it predict human data in completely new situations that were not part of the training data? That is really what we would want out of a foundation model of human cognition, right? So, and the first most obvious question that one could perhaps ask is, can Centaur predict the behavior of new participants that were not part of the training data? So for this analysis that I'm showing here, we looked at new participants, but these participants did experiments that were part of the training data, but in the training data, they were done by other participants. So we went ahead and implemented a collection of domain-specific cognitive models for a large set of the experiments that are part of Psych 101. So these kind of cognitive models that we implemented kind of represent the state of the art that you find in the literature. They all have been previously used to capture and explain human behavior for each individual of these domains. And we measure how well a model captures human behavior simply using log likelihoods of human responses under the distribution produced by a given model. And the results that I'm showing here show these log likelihoods relative to the log likelihoods of these domain-specific cognitive models that I've just talked about. So meaning, and this is this gray dotted line here, centered at 0. I show the difference. So if we're to the right of the side, means that the model predicts human behavior better than these domain-specific cognitive models. If we are to the left of the side, it means that it's worse. And we indeed found that Centaur predicts human behavior better than the domain-specific cognitive models in pretty much all of the experimental paradigms that we looked at. And I think that is quite exciting, right? It really indicates that we have a unified model that captures human behavior across this really large set of domains, and it does so better than the leading theories that you find in the literature, at least in terms of predicting human behavior. You can also repeat this analysis with the llama-based model, and it turns out actually that model is also already quite good at predicting human behavior. But nevertheless, we see still quite a substantial benefit of fine-tuning. So really making sure that what we did, that we went into the whole trouble of fine-tuning the model, was actually worth it. Then, obviously, in the end, we are interested in much stronger forms of generalization. And that's why we did a series of increasingly complex out-of-distribution checks to really probe the generalization abilities of the model. And one of the questions that we asked is, can Centaur also generalize to new experiments that were not part of the training data? Psych 101, the training data that is behind Centaur, contains a lot of these two-armed bandit problems where you have to repeatedly choose between two options and you get reward feedback for doing so. But we purposefully left out any three-armed bandit problems because we wanted to see whether Centaur can generalize under these structural modifications of the problem. We went ahead, tested this, and the plot here shows now this time negative log likelihoods of human responses under different models. So lower here means that a model is more aligned with human behavior. We see that there's this relative benefit of fine-tuning. So Centaur, even in this out-of-distribution domain, captures human behavior better than the llama-based model that we have used. And we also see that if we do the same analysis with a traditional cognitive model, so in this case, this is a simple Rescola-Wagner model, it's not really able to make this generalization from the two-armed bandit data to the three-armed bandit data, where Centaur really was robust to these structural modifications in the underlying problem. We also investigated whether Centaur is able to predict behavior that doesn't come from humans or whether it can't do that. And that is quite an important analysis, right? Because we only want Centaur to predict, we don't want it to predict arbitrary behavior, but we only want it to predict human behavior. So the analysis that we did looked at these two-player economic games where two players play against each other. Each player in each round has to choose whether they want to cooperate or defect, and then they repeat this process multiple times. And then the experiment that we looked at, there was a search observer, so to say, that had to predict the responses made by one of these players. That player could have been either a human or an artificial agent that had matched behavior with matched statistics, but notably unhuman-like behavior. And importantly, this observer that had to predict the responses wasn't aware whether that particular agent that makes the choices is a human or an artificial agent. And the original paper found that people are quite good at predicting the behavior of other people, but they are not able to predict the behavior of these artificial agents with matched statistics. So we simulated Centaur on this kind of experiment, and it's quite a strong generalization test because in our training data, there's no task at all of any shape or form that matches this particular experiment. All the data sets that are part of Psych 101 are single player experiments, so we don't have any multiplayer settings here. So really strong test for generalization. And we found that Centaur indeed replicated the same effect that you find in people. It's able to predict behavior of people, but it's not able to predict the behavior of artificial agents with matched behavioral statistics. And that's quite cool, right? It really indicates that the model has picked up on some kind of latent constructs of human cognition. It's not purely engaging in just plain statistical learning. And lastly, the last thing I want to present here in this part is we also asked what happens to the internal representations of the model. Do they also get more aligned with human neural activity? And that is not obvious at all, right? Because we only ever fine-tuned the model on human response data. So really testing whether it also gets more similar, or the internal activations of the model get more similar to neural activity is quite a strong test for the model's capabilities. So we took human data from an fMRI experiment that involved a two-step task that we have seen earlier. We translated this in our text-based format. We gave these prompts to Centaur and recorded its internal activations. And then we tried to predict human fMRI activity based on the internal representations that we extracted from Centaur using a simple linear transformation. The plot here shows the results of this analysis. It shows how predictable representations are extracted from a particular layer, shown on the x-axis, of brain-wide human fMRI activity. In this case, this is measured using a simple Pearson correlation between the actual measured signals and signals predicted by a particular set of representations. And we found indeed that if we compare Centaur, which corresponds to the purple line, to the Llama base model, which corresponds to the pink line, that models also got, or the internal activations of the model got more similar to human neural activity. We also repeated this analysis with a traditional domain-specific cognitive model. So in this case, it's a combination of a model-free and a model-based reinforcement learning model. And we found that the internal state of such a model is not expressive enough to really robustly capture brain-wide human fMRI activity, while really indicating that you need these large-scale models like Centaur to even perform these kind of analysis. So in the paper, we have a lot of additional analysis. We also show that the model is robust to semantic changes. So for example, when we use a cover story that was not part of a training data, it can still robustly predict human behavior, even when faced with this totally new cover story. We also show that it generalizes to completely novel experiments that were not part of the training data in any shape or form. For example, this data set from the moral machines experiment that I'm showing here. And finally, we also show that the model is able to capture secondary measurements beyond responses. So just shown the analysis where I've argued that Centaur is able to predict human neural activity, but we also show that the model is able to predict human response time better than alternative approaches. And all of these analyses together really show that training on this large data set of human behavior on Psych 101 that we have collected, and fine-tuning a model on that really leads to a system that is able to generalize far beyond the training data and really capture human behavior across a wide range of different situations. But really now, I think the million-dollar question for cognitive science is, how can we take these behaviorally predictive models and use them to improve our understanding of human cognition, right? That is ultimately what we would want to do with these models. And that's a question I've been thinking a lot about recently and started to work on a bit. So I want to present like one case study, which is the first study that we did, or first type of analysis that we did, where we used both Psych 101 and Centaur to improve our understanding of human cognition. Essentially, in this case study, our goal is to use Centaur and also Psych 101 to guide the development of an interpretable cognitive model, similar to the models that we all know. So this setting, or this case study, is set in a multi-attribute decision-making paradigm. So in this type of paradigm, people get presented with two options. In this case here, these two bicycles. These options are rated by 4 different experts. These experts, in this case here, give binary ratings of these two options, and this either approving of the product or disapproving of it. And then each expert is also assigned a so-called validity. These validities essentially indicate how trustworthy a given expert is, or the rating of this expert are. And then after being presented with all of this information, human participants in the study have to make a judgment which product they think is superior in terms of quality. So essentially asking them, which of these two products would you buy if they were equal in price? This is an experimental paradigm that has been really extensively studied in cognitive science, economics, neuroscience over the recent decades. And people over the years have come up with quite a large set of potential explanations and strategies that people might use to solve these kind of problems. So there's, for instance, the weighted additive strategy, which essentially says that people make decisions based on a linear combinations of these validities and rankings that we have seen. So I've put these equations here. Equations are not so important. I think all of these strategies that I will talk about are quite intuitive to express in language. But then there are also simpler strategies that have been proposed over the years. For example, there is so-called equal weighting heuristic, which essentially says people ignore all of the information that is in these validities, how valid a given expert is. They only take the count of positive ratings into consideration when making a decision. An alternative heuristic is the so-called take the best heuristic. Essentially says that people only look at the ratings of the highest validity expert, and only if there's a tie between the ratings of the highest validity expert, they move on to the second highest validity expert, and so on. So we took all of these 3 strategies and turned them into computational models, and then tried to see on a data set of human behavior in this paradigm, how well do these models capture human behavior. For the analysis that I'm showing here, I used the AIC measurement to capture goodness of fit to human responses. So lower values here mean that the model provides a better explanation for human behavior. And when we just look at these 3 strategies, it's on this data set that we have considered for this, it seems like the weighted additive strategy would offer the best explanation for human behavior in such a setting. And that's consistent with the results from the original paper, which we took the experimental data from. They essentially reported as well, most participants in this experiment seem to apply an equal weighting strategy. But then when we compare these goodness of fits to the goodness of fits of Centaur, we see that there's quite a lot of room for improvement, right? And just this single number that I'm showing here alone really already illustrates how Centaur is useful to guide the development of cognitive theories, right? Gives you kind of like a lower bound of how good, roughly at least, your cognitive model can be at predicting human behavior. And this is quite a useful piece of information, I think, for researchers and scientists. And in this case here, we see there is quite a lot of room for improvement. So we thought, well, can we now use Psych 101 and Centaur to really close this gap? And one of the cool features of the Psych 101 dataset is that we have all of this human data in a natural language format readily available, which means that it can be analyzed by some of these reasoning-based language models, such as the recent DeepSeek R1 model. So, well, we thought, let's try this out. We wanted to give a transcript of an entire session from a human participant to the DeepSeek-R1 model and then ask it, hey, can you generate me an explanation for that particular participant's behavior targeted at an expert cognitive scientist? And we actually found that the model produced quite interesting explanations. So here's one example. It says that the participant employed a two-step decision-making strategy. So first, they determined which product had the majority of positive ratings across the expert. And then if there was a tie in the number of positive ratings, then the participants considered the rating from the highest validity expert to break this tie. And if you remember the strategies that I talked about on the previous slide, you will actually notice that this is a combination of two of the heuristics that I've just shown. But best to my knowledge, these two heuristics have not been considered as in this particular combination as a possible explanation for how people might solve these problems. So we thought, well, let's turn this verbal description that was given by the DeepSeek-R1 model into a computational model. Essentially, this model says that people make a decision based on equal weighting strategy. If the strategy is available, if the strategy is not available because there's a tie, well, then this model will resort to take the best heuristic instead. And then we found actually that this model discovered by DeepSeek-R1, as we are seeing on the left here, explains the human data better than the three original models that we have considered in our analysis. And I think that is already quite an interesting finding, right? Because the conclusion that we draw from this new model that we have added is quite different from the one that we had originally. Originally, we assumed, or the results seem to indicate that people would apply a weighted additive strategy, which is sometimes in this context also referred to as the rational strategy to these problems. But here, really, the strategy discovered by DeepSeek-R1 seems to indicate that people instead rely on this very particular and intricate combination of two heuristic strategies to make decisions in such a setting. But then still, we see the gap to the Centaur model remains quite substantial, really indicating, okay, there is more room for improvement. And then the next step, we wanted to use our Centaur model to further close this gap by this interpretable cognitive model and this black box foundation model of human cognition that we have here. And one framework for doing this, I think that is quite natural in this context, is a framework that is also called scientific regret minimization. It's a framework that takes an interpretable cognitive model, for example, the one that we have just that was discovered by DeepSeek-R1, and a black box predictive model of human cognition. So in this case, this is our Centaur model. And then it compares these models against each other on every data point and tries to, through this comparison, identify data points that are in principle predictable because they are predicted by the black box predictive model, but that are not predicted yet by the interpretable cognitive model. And then you take these points that are predictable, you visualize them, you essentially apply the method of staring. You look at them really hard and you try to identify what are the components that are missing in my interpretable cognitive model. What do I have to add? So we applied this process to this particular data set here, starting with the model that was discovered by DeepSeek-R1, which was the one that previously performed best in the analysis so far. And the data points that we identified in this process all essentially looked similar to this pair here. You always had one option, the right one here in this case, which had the higher number of positive ratings, but another option which had fewer positive ratings overall, but that was rated higher by a higher validity expert. So in this case, the strategy that was suggested by DeepSeek-R1 would assume that people choose the right option because the equal weighting strategy is available. Option 2 has more positive ratings, so people should choose that. But in the actual data and also in Centaur, we found that in both these cases, people in both Centaur preferred the option that is shown on the left here with fewer positive ratings and rated higher by a higher validity expert. So this really seems to indicate that this combination of the two heuristics that was proposed by DeepSeek-R1 is maybe useful, but it's maybe not so strict that it was initially suggested. So we thought, well, let's take this as a starting point and essentially, instead of using this very strict either-or rule of switching between the heuristic, we treat this as an additional free parameter and basically use linear combination of both of the heuristic strategies of take the best and equal weighting. We implemented that in a computational model, and we found that this model that emerged from this process of scientific regret minimization actually captured the data as well as the Centaur model, so really as well as this black box predictive model, while maintaining this very interpretable character, right? One can look at this equation and essentially directly get a feeling for how do people make decisions in such a context. And I think this case study that I've talked about really presents nicely of how we can use these large-scale predictive models of human behavior to guide the development of interpretable cognitive models. So I think that already leads me to the end. I've talked about Centaur, first foundation model of human cognition, shown that Centaur predicts behavior of held out participants, that it generalizes to completely novel experiments that were not part of the training data, and also that it captures secondary measurements like reaction times and neural activity. And finally, I've presented first case study in which we have shown how both the dataset and the model can be used to support scientific discovery. And I think that is really the most exciting part about this research direction, and there are a lot of exciting opportunities that now basically present themselves. You can think about how we want to use, for example, a model like Centaur in the context of automated cognitive science, right? Can be, for example, used for in silico prototyping of behavioral studies before putting them out in the wild. Or it could be used for optimal experimental design, kind of thinking about how do I even have to design my experiment to maximally increase my knowledge that I have about human cognition. And I think that is especially important in the age of these really large-scale studies that cost sometimes tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars to run them. We really want to make sure that the experiment that we are running is informative about human cognition. Another research direction I think that is really interesting is now to poke at the internal dynamics of these black box foundation models of human cognition like Centaur, and try to study what is going on in these models internally and use the results to generate new hypotheses about human information processing that you can then subsequently verify in both behavioral and neural experiments. In the near future, my goal is also not only to fine-tune language models on this large-scale data set that we have generated here, but instead to train models with different architectures from scratch on it. And ideally, these different architectures should encapsulate different assumptions that we make about human cognition and human information processing. So essentially, that means that you can test a series of human cognition at a completely unprecedented scale. For example, you could ask human information processing across this large set of experiments that we have, is that maybe more similar to a transformer architecture, like the ones that we find in this language model? Is it more similar to a recurrent neural network? Do we have to incorporate additional forms of memory to best capture human behavior, and so on? I think really the possibilities here are almost endless. And then finally, everything I've talked about so far today is basically ignoring any kind of individual differences. We just have one model that captures the entire population jointly. But we, of course, know there's a lot of variability in human behavior, right? And that's why we are currently collecting a data set that places a very strong emphasis on these individual differences. Includes, for example, metadata such as age, nationality from cross-cultural studies, or medical diagnosis from clinical studies. And I think having such a data set will really enable completely new types of analysis of human behavior. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thanks all of my collaborators who helped in this project. A really large-scale effort to build a data set and a model like this. And thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to take questions.